Walking with Jesus through the Gospels, and we are in John chapter 18. We are in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, we're not going to begin reading in John 18 directly. I'd like for us to begin by looking at some laws that were in place and some observances, stipulations that were put in place either through Scripture or rabbinic sources. So sources from the rabbis that had stipulated this is what needs to be observed concerning a court proceeding or matters of charges against somebody, so they could be determining what's going on. All right, so there's 22 of them that we're going to be looking at. So it's going to be brought up on the screen, and then we're going to track through them. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time as we detail these. We're just going to list them as they come on the screen so that we are aware of them. And then if you want them for your notes later, I can bring those screens back up and then you can take those notes, all right? So, having a look at that, here we go. The first that we're looking at is there's not to be any arrest that is affected by a bribe. So we see that in Exodus chapter 23 and verse 8. In other words, if somebody, pardon me?
You don't have the thingies?
No, I just have the observance that's up there. So, in other words, you couldn't have somebody bribe in order to have an arrest made. All right? Second one, there's no criminal proceedings to take place after sunset. So the sun goes down, there's not to be any hearings at all. Third one, judges and/or the Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin is what made up the judges of the day that Jesus is concerned with. So judges are prohibited from participating in any arrest. They can't be the arresting party. Number 4, no trials before a morning or the morning sacrifice. Number 5, there aren't to be any secret trials. Number 6, Sanhedrin trials could only be conducted in what was referred to as the Hall of Judgment, which was in the temple compound. The purpose for this was so that it could be a publicly attended proceeding. So that is what then prevented or avoided it being a secret trial. So it was referred to as, the place where they were was the chamber of the hewn stones, is what that was called. Number 7, the defense had the first word before accusations were made. So the defense made their case. So you didn't come like in what we would see in a Western court today. It wasn't that the prosecutors laid the charges and laid it out and said, here's what the person is being charged with. The defense would say, these are all of the reasons why this person is not guilty. Speak of character and speak of history and just any facts that would have been helpful in the case. The defense would have been heard first. So basically, why the person could not be guilty, or arguing for them not to be guilty. Number 8. We bring in that number 8 is not up there yet, so just one sec. Here we go. All could argue, sir, all that are in the court could argue in favor of acquittal of the person who is standing trial. But not all could argue in favor of a conviction. In other words, you couldn't have a lopsided in favor of conviction. You could have heavily weighted in favor of being acquitted. Make sense? Okay, following so far? So there had to be at least one defender. You couldn't have nobody in there to defend the person who's being accused. Number 9, there needed to be 2 to 3 witnesses. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 15. At least 2 to 3 witnesses in order to make the charge stick. Number 10, the accused was not allowed to testify against himself. So incriminating evidence, in other words, they couldn't take the stand and try to make an accusation or to agree with the accusations that is being brought against them. Number 11, the high priest was forbidden from tearing his garments. Leviticus chapter 21 and verse 10. Number 12, judges could not initiate charges. They could only investigate a charge that was brought to their attention. Number 13, an accusation of blasphemy was only valid if the name of God was pronounced. So the Yud He Vav He. Only if that name was pronounced in the time of Jesus, because they had come to the determination. And remember, these are some of the fence laws that are involved, right? So if somebody pronounced the name of God, they were concerned that they may end up breaking the third commandment. You must not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And so they had determined not to pronounce the name Yud He Vav He. So it was only in that context that somebody could be convicted of blasphemy. Number 14. The accused could not be condemned solely on the basis of his own words. So he might say, I am guilty, I did it, but could not be found guilty on the basis of his own words. Any idea why that might be the case? In case he's lying. Yeah, this person may be depressed, suicidal, they want to take their life, and this would be a good way to do it. I'm talking about capital crimes here, right? So crimes that are for capital punishment. So yeah, they may be trying to cover up for somebody else. Whatever the situation, there's a whole bunch of scenarios that could take place. But they could not be condemned based on their own words alone. Number 15, the verdict could not be announced at nighttime. Number 16, for capital punishment, trial and guilty verdict had to be at least 24 hours apart. You did not announce the verdict at the same point as the trial was ending. 24-hour duration in between. Number 16. That was 16. Number 17. Death penalty vote had to be by individual count, beginning with youngest, so as to be so the youngest would not be influenced by the elders. I had written something down wrong, and I was like, that doesn't make sense what I have written here. All right, individual vote starting with the youngest up to the oldest. Number 18. Unanimous decision for guilt implied there was a conspiracy among those who were judging. So there could not be a unanimous decision for guilt because the person was presumed innocent unless proven beyond reasonable doubt that was guilty. Remember, there's 71 persons in the Sanhedrin. Didn't need to be all 71 present, but there needed to be a majority that were present. Number 19. Sentence could only be pronounced 3 days after a guilty verdict. So the trial, remember back in number 16, trial ends. 24 hours later, a verdict of guilt or innocence could be pronounced. If guilt was pronounced at that verdict, then they needed to wait 3 days after that before sentencing could then be determined. Number 20. Judges were to be humane and kind. So they weren't to be vindictive or overbearing. I said that this was regarding capital cases. I misspoke that. Some of these aspects in the case of capital incidences, and then it gave those. Like 16, in the case of capital punishment, the trial and guilty verdict had to be 24 hours apart, and so on. Number 21, a person condemned to death was not to be scourged before his execution, because they were to be humane, kind. What would be the purpose of scourging them if they're about to be executed? So they wanted it to be basically an eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth, following the measure of the law. And lastly, number 22, no trials allowed on the eve of the Sabbath or a feast day. So there's a lot going on with the stipulations, rules, regulations, observances of court proceedings.
0 out of 22 for
Yeah, I
Jesus.
think 22. Every one of them was violent.
Every one of these were violated with Jesus. Every single one of them. And now we're going to look at them and see, okay, this is where these are applied, okay? With that in mind, let's go to John chapter 18. John 18. I can type it out. I have it typed out. I can print it off, and if you'd like to have copies of that, I can get them printed for you. So if that's preferential, saves a lot of writing.
Can you copy and email that?
I can do that too. Yep. I can do it either way, because it'll just be a matter of I press print or I press send, in whichever way it ends up being done. So if you prefer to have it like digitally, I can do that. If you want it digitally and print, I can do that. If you want it just print, I can do that as well. So your choice. Let's take it in John 18, 1 to 11. Let's start over here tonight.
When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden which he and his disciple entered. Now Judas, who had betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken, "Of those whom you gave me, I've lost not one." Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?"
All right, how many of these proceedings were contravened already at the beginning. Remember the very first one? No bribe can affect an arrest. So here they are in verse 2. Judas, who betrayed him, comes to the place, and we see verse 3 that Judas, having procured a band of soldiers, some officers from the chief priests and so on. So Judas is there not just for a visit or to hang out with the disciples as he always had done, but he's there for the purpose of securing his arrest. Without Judas, the arrest isn't taking place tonight. And of course, Judas is there because he received a bribe. So some might say, well, he didn't receive a bribe. He offered to do it. A bribe, some might say, is when somebody says, here's some money for you to do this, to try to entice somebody to do something.
Didn't he ask, what will you give me?
He asked, what will you give me? But it's still him making the offer. Now, would that stand up in a court of law today? That no, I did not receive a bribe. No, because you are being compensated for the corruption of the arrest. All right? So, being offered money in order to arrest somebody was considered a bribe. So, we've got number 1 already is being contravened. Verse 3, what do we see? They come at night, so after sunset. They're coming with torches, so indicating that it's nighttime. But even apart from that aspect that they're coming with torches, how do we know that it's nighttime?
It was already night when they left the dinner.
It was already night when we left dinner because it's Thursday night, right? And so what have we, I know it's been 2 weeks since we've been together, and it's a long night when you have to spend 2 weeks to go through it. So actually we've been 3 weeks, three total evenings
You're
together.
going to mix me up now if we get doing that.
All right, so we're still on Thursday evening, right? So this day began with the disciples making preparations for the Passover meal. They shared the Passover together, and Jesus has now led them to the Garden of Gethsemane, the Gethsemane. And he's prayed and so on, and now Judas has arrived. We know that it's evening, and it's probably coming on late into close to midnight by this time, at easily coming on to midnight at this point. So we know that it's nighttime. And Judas is there, and it says that he had procured what to come with him? A detachment of soldiers. Another translation uses the word a band of soldiers. Anything else that is used to describe that?
Detachment of troops.
Detachment of troops. All right. Now, any idea what kind of a size of a group that is coming with Judas? 50? Okay. Good guess. That'd be a sizable amount, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
In the Greek, this word, a detachment or a band of soldiers, is the word spira. S-P-E-I-R-A. We would know it as S-P-E-I-R-A. It could be known as a cohort. And a cohort of soldiers was some 480 to 600 soldiers. That's a cohort. These are Roman soldiers that are coming with Judas. This is not a small group of people. Now, besides that, not only do we have a cohort of soldiers, but we also see who is with them. So, officials from the chief priests and from the Pharisees. Now, the word officials there isn't quite descriptive enough for us to recognize what the Greek is telling us. It's actually, so when you hear officials of the chief priests, what does that seem to indicate? So representatives of the chief priests, right? This is officers. sent by or dispatched by the chief priests. So what this means is that there were temple police. So there were Roman soldiers, but the Roman soldiers could not enter the temple precincts, right? And we know that because at the temple, there was the outer court, the court of the Gentiles, where anyone could come. So that would be, well, let's bring up this next slide. Don't know if it's clear enough for us here. But on the temple precincts, everything that is on the main platform, except for the temple itself, is the court of the Gentiles. So for ease, I'll take care of this. Maybe I should give it back to you. There we go. All right, so the temple precincts is right here. And the temple itself is this. So everything outside of the temple is referred to, that platform is the court of the Gentiles. So anybody could go into the court of the Gentiles. And then as you came closer beyond that outer court, you come into the court of the women. Then you came into the court of the men. And each court that you come to is getting closer to the temple itself. Then the court of the priests. Then the temple itself, and then it would be inside the temple, and only the priests could go into the holy place, and only the high priest could go into the most holy place, and that only once a year. To give a bit of an idea there. So anyone could be in the outer court. That's why it's called the court of the Gentiles. But there were inscriptions at the court of the women that any Gentile that would go past that point was punishable by death. And it was written in Hebrew or Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, so that you would be without excuse. And so not even the Roman cohorts, the Roman soldiers could go past that point. So there were temple police, and they were to enforce matters around the temple precincts, and particularly inside the temple courts themselves. So you've got a cohort of soldiers, you've got an unspecified number of temple police, and they are all armed. And then you've got chief priests that are coming as well, and the Pharisees. So you've got a huge group of people that are in pursuit of Jesus.
So by that army size, 480 to 600. Those who do the math in my head. And if they figured on every disciple being in opposition, taking them as well as Jesus, minus Judas, because he was cooperating, that's 40 to 50 men per disciple or per Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
A lot.
A little bit of overkill, except what do we see when Jesus says, "Who are you seeking?" They all fell backwards. Now, if you are one of them that they have fallen down, I'm not getting back up again, because obviously we don't have enough people.
Well, if I was getting it back up, I just keep going the other way.
Exactly. Get reinforcements. And even if we got reinforcements, it looks like we're all going down. But does that not show the power of his word?
Yeah.
He didn't swing a club. He didn't go boom. Okay? All he needed to do was say, "I am."
Declare himself.
Just declare himself. That was all. That speaks volumes even today in many who represent Jesus, or supposed to represent Jesus. And I'm talking about names that may be televangelists, or perhaps they're not on televised, but they are in whatever capacity, and they're doing all of these theatrics and big, movements, and as though that implies or shows the amount of power or authority. No. The more you need to do this indicates the lack of power and authority. Anyway, throw that in for our consideration. It's for free. I have no charge on that one. But it's for us to consider, all right? Jesus, all he did was saying, I am. That's it. We're going to look at that, a thought regarding that further in just a moment. A cohort of soldiers didn't just get dispatched to investigate something out of curiosity or speculation. Cohort was released by the governor upon an accusation that has been leveled. Who's the one who's made the accusation? Close. Who are they using? Judas. Judas is being used for the purpose of dispatching these soldiers. They didn't want to do it tonight because that wasn't their plan. But their hand has been forced by Jesus. Because Jesus is Lord. And he's in control of all that's taking place right now. All right. We've read, let's go to Luke 22. So remember, all of the Gospels are dealing with aspects of what's taking place at this point. So Luke 22, let's look at verse 50 to 52. John, please.
And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said, "Permit even this." And he touched his ear and healed him. And Jesus said to the chief priests, captains of the temple, and the elders who had come to him, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs?"
All right. So we've got those who are chief priests and elders. We've already seen it back in John. We can see it in the other Gospels as well. So we've already had number 1 and number 2 of those stipulations and guidelines and regulations have been contravened. The third one is now contravened, and the third one is judges are prohibited from participating in an arrest. Here they are. These ones who are the judges, chief priests, and the elders. So they weren't permitted to participate in an arrest because now they're what? They're biased. It's showing a bias against the accused. All right, so we had mentioned that Jesus made the declaration, I am. Who are you looking for? I am. Of course, we see that this is I am. When you say, well, wait a minute, he said I am he. He is not in the Greek. That's indicated there, that's added there to give indication he's speaking about himself. But it doesn't exist in the Greek. And it is taken from where? Where does this?
Exodus. The burning bush.
Yeah, so Exodus chapter 3 and verse 14. Exodus 3 and 14. So it is there that Jesus, the angel of the Lord, appears to Moses and speaks to him from the bush that's burning. And then he tells Moses, Eya. So that's his name. Not Yud-He-Vav-He, but Eya. Eya is I am. Yud-He-Vav-He is what you and I would use to refer to him. Only Jesus, the Father, and the Holy Spirit can use the word Eya. I am. We would say it in a sense, he is. That's what Yud-He-Vav-He, Yahweh is. He is in that sense. Because we can't use the term in the same way. And so it's showing here that Jesus, he is Lord, that he is God. Well, an aspect of what he's doing here is that he's demonstrating it's not for a lack of power that he's being taken to his death. In this display, had he not shown this, if he didn't say, I am Ea, if he didn't say that, and if they didn't fall back, he would just be appearing like he's a man like any other. So it wasn't for a lack of power that he's being arrested. He's demonstrating that in everyone being subjected to the declaration of his word. So it's not only that it's a declaration or demonstration of his power, but it's also a demonstration more so of his love. Because he's allowing himself to be arrested because of his great love for the world, to redeem mankind from their sins. It's an incredible consideration, isn't it? All right. John chapter 18, we've already looked at it, verses 7 to 11. Who is it that strikes the high priest's servants and cuts off his ear? But if you read Matthew, Mark, or Luke, you wouldn't know who it was who did it. It would say one of their number cut off the servant's ear. And only John mentions the high priest's servant by name. Why do you suppose, was John trying to paint Peter in a bad light? Don't think so, no. What does name, first-hand names indicate? Relationship. You know the person, and it speaks of eyewitness account. Now, it doesn't mean that somebody who's an eyewitness that didn't name the person didn't see it, but it's a different perspective to show us that they were there. They saw it. It wasn't hearsay. This is first-hand account. And John names the chief priest's servant's name. Why?
He knew him anyway.
He knew him. He knew him. We read just a little bit further on that when Jesus is taken to the chief priest's house, that John and Peter followed along, and that John knew the members of. Well, let's just have a look at that. Pardon me?
He was known to the
He was known to the high priest, and that's in verse 15.
He get in, didn't he? They let him inside.
John?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's in verse 15. Let's just have a look at that. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. This is how John speaks of himself. He doesn't draw attention to himself when it's in a good light. He doesn't draw attention to himself at all. So he does it in that third person sense. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, so he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. So he knew the high priest. So in so doing, the servant of the high priest, not a servant of the high priest, but the servant of the high priest, would have most obviously been known to John as well in that similar capacity. Only John names Peter and the name of the high priest's servant, and only Luke mentions what Jesus does for that servant. Luke was a doctor. That's important, exactly. Jesus reached out and healed the man's ear. It's amazing that Jesus did that for his enemies. Incredible. All right, well, let's...
So I wonder if this guy became a believer.
I think I would.
Yeah.
Just put it out there.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's not far off to see that to be the case. The book of Acts tells us that a number of the priests became followers of the way. And that's what those who became disciples of Jesus became known as, followers of the way. With this taking place, now Jesus is arrested, and he's going to be taken to be tried. Now, where do they take him to? The high priest? Pardon me? Ananias?
Is that his name? Annas? I may understand his name.
It depends upon which translation. Both are right. Annas and Ananias. Ananias comes from the Hebrew, and so it would be a transliteration in that version of the Bible. Annas comes from the Greek. Okay, so Ananias from the Hebrew, Annas from the Greek. So they say that he's taken to Annas' place or Ananias' place. I'm just turning to that. Sorry, I was a page back. So they arrested him, and this is in verse 13. It says, first they led him to Annas, because he was the father of Caiaphas. Caiaphas was high priest that year. So why did they take him to Annas?
He was the former high priest.
He was the former high priest. So we've got A here, and he was, so Annas, he was the high priest. He has 5 sons. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each one of them will eventually serve as a high priest. And he had a son-in-law. Sons here. That's a pretty poor chart. But anyway, we've got Caiaphas here, who is the high priest at this point in time. His sons, so here's I was going to put son-in-law and abbreviate it, but that would be sin. No, that would be S-I-L. Here we can do that. S-I-L. And here are his sons. We had mentioned that when we looked at the instruction that Jesus gave in Luke chapter 16 regarding the rich man and Lazarus. They both died. The rich man and how he was dressed, and he had 5 brothers, and all that pointed towards was the high priest and Annas' 5 sons. So, very political. Annas is like the Jewish godfather. He's in charge still, although he doesn't hold the title of high priest, but he does so in the sense of American presidents, for instance. When a president is no longer president, he's still referred to as president for the rest of his life.
Up until the 45th one, anyway.
Up until the 45th. But he's still referred to as President Trump, except for where there's people who refuse to do that. But officially, he is President Trump, President Obama, President Bush, and so on, President Reagan. After their term in office, they are still president, but they don't hold power unless you hold power behind the scenes. And that's a whole kettle of fish we're not going to get into tonight.
That's called influence.
But it's influence, all right? So
Kind of like this.
but it's a similar idea. The sitting president is like Caiaphas. And a former president is like Annas, who's influencing the current sitting president.
What's interesting is that people that had Jesus at that point didn't go to Caiaphas, and Caiaphas went behind the scenes to get advice. They went directly to the man behind the scenes.
Exactly. Yeah, they did. Which is quite interesting, isn't it? He's going to question him, and then he will send him to Caiaphas. Make sense? So we see that. Let's just work a timeline here, all right? So in verse 13, they led him to Annas. And then we see that Caiaphas was high priest that year, but not just that year, but for a period of years, I think 7 or 8 years, maybe more. I can't recall how long his term was that he served as high priest. But it wasn't just for 1 year, okay? It was for several years. And it was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Do you remember him saying that? We're all there when he said it, or at least when we heard about him saying it. So this was in John chapter 11, saying that it's expedient that one man die for all the nation. And he spoke this being high priest that year. So he was speaking prophetically. He didn't know that he was speaking prophetically. He was just giving advice. It's better for him to die than us to lose our position, our place. Then we see that
High priest for 18 years.
18 years, okay, better than double the amount that I had mentioned. 18 to 36 were the years that he was high priest. So he questions in verse 19. Jesus answers him. And then in verse 24, Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So there were some questionings that were taking place before he makes his way to Caiaphas. So this is essentially the first trial, verses 12 to 24 of John chapter 18. So we'll call that first stage of the trial. When I speak the first stage of the trial, this is the religious trial, because there's going to be two trials. There's going to be the religious trial, and then there's going to be the secular trial. Religious trial before the chief priests and the Sanhedrin. The secular trial will be before Pilate and Herod. In Matthew chapter 26 and verse 56, just retracing our steps for a minute. This is still in the garden. So Carolyn, would you mind reading that, please?
But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets may be fulfilled, that all the disciples deserted him and fled.
So Jesus has already prophesied that they would all be scattered. This was back when they were sharing the meal together. And now we're seeing it taking place. And all that was transpiring in the garden at that point, where he was betrayed, turned upon, or turned against. A couple of passages that we can look at. Fulfillment of that is Zechariah chapter 13 and verse 7. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. That's what Jesus spoke about earlier that evening. It's still in Matthew 26, verse 31. So it's a fulfillment of Zechariah chapter 13 and verse 7. For your notes, for those of you that are taking notes, there's a fulfillment of this also, of Psalm chapter 88 and verse 8. We're going to go there for a moment. A lot of eights in this text is Psalm 88, verse 8 and verse 18. And we're at Johnny, please.
Psalms 88, 18.
Verse 8 first, and then 18, please.
Okay, verse 8. You have taken from me my closest friends, and have made me repulsive to them. 18. You have taken, oh, I have made me, and have made me repulsive to them. I am confined and cannot escape. My eyes are dim with grief. 18 is that you have taken my companions and loved ones from me. The darkness is my closest friend.
You notice what Jesus says to them? You have come in the dark of night. You could have come to me at any time during the day, but you come when the strength is at night, because that's where their power lies. Speaking of evil, Satan, power of darkness, it's coming against them. One more passage is in Isaiah chapter 63 and verse 5.
I looked, but there was no one to help. I was appalled that no one gave support. So my own arm worked salvation for me, and my own wrath sustained me.
Mm-hmm. It's showing here that there's nobody that could secure or help in the matter of salvation. They all deserted Jesus. Now, some would keep some close proximity, but they are not alongside of him. They can't do anything to enhance or to encourage or to participate in the work of salvation. So that's an aspect that's taking place here to demonstrate that very clearly. Coming back to John chapter 18. We've already mentioned a few aspects, but I want us to see this once again. So we looked at Simon Peter in verse 15. What does he do? He follows Jesus along with John, the other disciple, since that disciple was known to the high priest. Then we see Peter stood outside at the door, so the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. Now, is it the next day yet? So daylight has not yet happened. Yet, Annas has brought Jesus in for questioning, to interrogate him. Number 4 on our regulations. No trials are to take place before the morning sacrifice. Number 5. Okay, yeah, are you able to do that? Number 5, no secret trials. Where is this trial taking place? In the priest's courtyard. Then the next trial is going to take place at, or the former high priest, but yes, going to take at the active high priest's courtyard. So as such, where's everybody else right now?
Sleeping.
They're in bed, right? They have no idea that this is going on. So this is a secret trial because there's no opportunity for anyone to be there, even if they said, we're going to make room for you, but that wasn't the practice. So this is, by all accounts, a secret trial. Interesting to note. When Peter, he's here, and he's going to make his first denial that he knows Jesus. Have a look there, and he says, can somebody read verse 17?
You are not one of his disciples, are you? girl at the door asked Peter. He replied, I am not.
All right. He says, I'm not one of his disciples. Yet, I want to look at the continuity of what's going on here. Verse 15 again. Simon Peter follows Jesus to Annas' place. So did John, since that disciple was known to the high priest. He entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. Peter stood outside at the door. So John, the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to whom? Not a servant girl, but the servant girl who was on duty keeping watch at the door. So she was the doorkeeper, if you will. Then the servant girl at the door said to Peter, same servant or a different? Same girl. Says, you're one of his disciples. Peter says, oh, I'm not. Yet she is come to that conclusion because he's with John. John has just introduced Peter, he's with me. And Peter and John is there following Jesus. He came in with Jesus. She's the keeper of the door. She knows who's coming in and for what purposes. You're one of his disciples.
Maybe she was about to let him in. Maybe she was about to invite him in with John.
Peter? Yeah, possibly. But here we see that he is declared specifically to her who he is and why he's there. Yet he denies why he's there. But you notice that his denial is not, firstly, as we, at least blatantly associated with Jesus. It's blatantly associated with the other disciples. You're one of his disciples. So he wants to disassociate himself. He wants to distance himself from the other disciples. At this point, it's not distancing himself from Jesus as much as it is one of his disciples. And this is the one to whom Jesus says, and I say that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not stand against it. It's interesting that the one who would be used by Jesus to stand and introduce the people of Israel to this entity, the church, the ecclesia in the Greek is what it's called, the gathering together, is Peter. And Peter will demonstrate a love for the church from that point on. But at this point, he's distancing himself from the church, what would become the church. But it's not Peter upon whom Jesus is going to build his church. Peter, Petra, means stone. Petros, upon this rock I will build my church. He's speaking of himself. He's speaking of the truth of the declaration that he has made. Who do people say that I am? Some say Elijah. Some say one of the prophets. Who do you say that I am? And that's when Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And when Jesus said, I tell you, you are Peter, because up until that time, he is Simon or Caiaphas. And upon this rock, you are Peter, upon this rock. So Peter is this play on words. You're a stone, and on the bed of the stream, the brook that ran there. And Jesus says, and upon this rock, which was indicative of the cliff, the mountain that was right beside Caesarea Philippi, where that declaration is made. So it's the declaration that he's speaking about. So it's interesting that in this context, that Jesus is making this statement. So, with this, we need to see that Peter has made a declaration earlier. He said, when Jesus says, Peter, I tell you, before the rooster crows tonight, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. And he said to him, no, I will be loyal to you. I will go to the grave for you. But loyalty doesn't happen just because somebody tries really hard. It's dependent upon Jesus to give them the strength and the ability to be loyal. There's only a couple of instances when the Gospels record all the same event. Does anybody know what events all 4 Gospels contain, apart from the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus? Feeding of the 5,000. Anything else? Good guess. No. Be Palm Sunday and Peter's denial. It's interesting that of all the things that all 4 Gospels would record together, apart from the crucifixion and resurrection, 3 are recorded. And of those 3, one of them happens to be Peter's denial. Does that seem interesting? I think there's an aspect of that to indicate don't overestimate ourselves. It's showing us there to emphasize not Peter's failure, but to emphasize to us don't overestimate yourself. We need to have a right acquiring or estimation of who we are, because the heart is deceitfully wicked above all else. We can't trust it. So we need to be completely dependent upon Jesus.
We've looked at that as well as God showing us grace, how we can bring people back from.
Absolutely, yeah. I think a big aspect of this is the response of Jesus on the 3rd time that Peter denies that he knows Jesus, when he's calling down curses upon himself. And I want us to go to Luke. We'll go to Luke chapter 22, 20. Thank you. Luke 22 and verse 61. Brian, would you mind, please?
The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. And Peter remembered the word that the Lord had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly.
So he denies Jesus for the 3rd time, and at that point, Jesus is being led out. What did Jesus do? He looks at Peter. It's a look of compassion. He's not condemning Peter in this action. He's not looking at him as an "I told you so." You see that to be the case because of his character, Jesus' character, and how he responds and interacts with him prior to this, and how he does so after this. He's not in a huff. He's not giving him the cold shoulder. He's not grilling him. He's not putting him on the bench for a period of time. At his resurrection, we'll look at it more when we come there, but when he is resurrected and Jesus speaks to Miriam, and says, "Go and tell my disciples," and Peter. Was it that he wasn't one of the disciples now? No. It was in a sense saying, and I want you to make sure you don't miss or leave out Peter, because human nature would be, Peter betrayed, he denied you. And so if he's not there, when I go and tell everybody else, okay, so what? He's saying, make sure Peter's not left out of this. You make sure that Peter is told. And it's only going to be a few hours before Jesus appears to him anyway. But he is emphasizing, Peter is not to be overlooked. Peter's not benched. He's not condemned.
Peter must have been heartbroken in that moment.
Well, yeah, we read it here, yeah.
Always felt sorry for Peter
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because of that. Not sorry, but I guess bad.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the look was more, what could have been just that look of like, see, Peter, this is why I'm doing this.
Because we can't do it on our own. I'm doing this for you. Mhm. We're going to finish up with just a couple of more looks. So we're still in Matthew 26. Look at verse 59. Oh, did we not just? Oh, I'm sorry. No, we were in Luke 22.
So where do you want us?
Matthew 26,
Yes.
59. Verse 59. I was in Matthew 26. Why weren't you?
We're not very good followers.
Back to Deb, please. Mhm.
Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death.
And back in verse 57, at this point now, they're at Caiaphas' place. Those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest. So here we see that who is being mentioned? The chief priests and how much of the Sanhedrin? The whole council. And what were they doing?
Secret false testimony.
Yeah, they're basically trying to frame him. So this contravenes number 7. The defense had the first word before accusations. And number 8, all could argue in favor of acquittal, but not all could argue in favor of conviction. There had to be at least one defender. So here we see the entire council is against Jesus.
So Nicodemus was a part of that council at this point, right?
Nicodemus is a member of the Sanhedrin, but it's quite likely that he's not at this hearing. Both him and Joseph of Arimathea came to Pilate after Jesus was crucified, asking for his body. So up until this point, they've been secret followers of Jesus, or skirting with the idea of being followers of his. But at this point, they're seeing the illegality of it. This probably happened back in John 11 when the high priest was saying that he needs to be put to death. Jesus does, but Nicodemus is speaking up in his defense. So it's probably at that point, about a month earlier, a little better than a month ago, that Nicodemus is standing up and he's beginning to see what's going on here is not right. So he wouldn't be one of the ones that is trying to convict Jesus
So
of being
all
guilty.
the council, that doesn't mean.
It doesn't mean everybody of the Sanhedrin. It means the council that is there.
Okay.
So there's 71 members of the Sanhedrin. That they were all there is not necessarily the case. It does say the whole council, but it means the whole council that would have been convened at that point to bring a decision. So at least a majority of the Sanhedrin. And I think at this point, we will press the pause button, and we will continue when we come together for our next treatment of our time together.